Hello, this is Paul Curtis with Cornell University, and today I'd like to talk about dealing with deer impacts and suburban damage in New York State. There are a number of potential negative deer impacts that can be caused by overabundant deer. By far and away from an economic and safety standpoint, deer vehicle collisions are extremely important in New York State. We try to reduce those. Crop damage is another issue. The last statewide survey that was done about a decade ago showed that New York growers lose about $59 million in crops to deer each year. Damage to landscape, ornamentals around homes can be extremely expensive for plant replacement. Well, we don't have a good sense on total cost in New York. Forest regeneration failures also are widespread throughout many regions in New York State. We don't have, again, an economic handle on this, but we do know that it occurs in regions throughout the state. With a lack of regeneration after a cut, that can impact biodiversity and things like forest birds or reptiles and amphibians. And finally, in urban areas where there are high deer densities, there also tends to be high incidence of ticks and Lyme disease in many parts of the state. So there's a positive association between deer abundance and Lyme disease. Deer vehicle accidents can be very serious. We estimate that somewhere between 70 and 100,000 deer a year are hit on New York highways. No one really knows the exact figure, but it's large. Different agencies and municipalities record deer vehicle accidents differently, so that makes it very hard to get consistent and reliable data across the state. We do know from the national crash database where deer vehicle collisions and animal collisions are reported, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 human fatalities annually associated with deer vehicle collisions nationwide. In larger states like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, usually there's at least 2 or 3 human fatalities associated with deer accidents each year. It's very difficult to try to prevent accidents, and we'll talk about some of the techniques that have been used and seem to be a bit more effective. Education for motorists is important, though driver behavior is extremely difficult to change. We know that the peak of deer accident occurs during October, November, and December each year. This is the peak of the breeding season, or the rut, when deer are moving about more than they normally would and crossing highways more frequently. Also, we know that the majority of deer vehicle collisions occur around dusk and dawn. Deer are crepuscular, which means they're most active around dusk and dawn, so it's no surprise the bulk of the accidents occur then. Drivers should note areas where they see deer crossing signs and where you see deer crossing the roads on your normal daily driving routines to work or school. Deer are creatures of habit, and they'll often use these areas across roads repeatedly. When driving at night, learn to scan the roadside for what deer eye reflections look like in your headlights. It might give you an extra second or 2 of reaction time to slow down that might avoid a collision at night. And we always encourage communities to manage herd density where possible. There have been several studies now that clearly show where communities can drastically reduce deer numbers, deer vehicle accident rates significantly drop. They don't go to zero. It's probably, without fencing or complete barriers, it's impossible to eliminate all the accidents, but where you really reduce deer density, accident numbers do go down. Years ago, New York State DEC recorded deer vehicle accidents, and even though the data are old, the pattern really hasn't changed. The peak month for deer vehicle collisions in New York is November, the peak of the rut or the breeding season, but 2/3 of the vehicle collisions that occur annually occur during October, November, December. These data miss another little blip in late May, early June, when adult does are ready to start having or giving birth to new fawn. They kick last year's fawns out of their home range, and so we just see a little blip in deer vehicle collisions, an increase in accidents primarily for bucks in late May, early June as they disperse and leave their birth home range. We know from a number of studies that, bells, whistles, gimmicks, all sorts of deer whistle things that you can put on your front bumper, they produce ultrasound, which doesn't carry far. Deer really don't hear it or distinguish it, and these type of bells and whistles simply don't work. We mentioned Lyme disease earlier. There are several diseases that are transported or transmitted to humans by two different tick species in New York State. By far and away, people are most familiar with Lyme disease or the black-legged tick. The adult male and adult female are tiny. The nymphs are very small, can easily be missed, and the larvae, which is the youngest growth stage of the tick, are as small as a grain of pepper and can easily be missed. Usually the larvae and nymph are attaching to either small or medium-sized mammals, where the adult ticks are usually attaching to people, deer, pets, other larger mammals for blood meals. The other tick of importance from a disease standpoint in New York is the Lone Star tick. These have always been more southern ticks in distribution, but with warming trends over the last 2 to 3 decades, tick populations appear to be moving north. The Lone Star ticks are now the most abundant tick on eastern Long Island. We're getting reports of Lone Star in the lower Hudson Valley. Similar to deer ticks, they're extremely small. Larvae, again, are the size of a pepper grain. Nymphs a little bit larger, and the adult male and the adult female are similar in size to deer ticks. They get the name Lone Star tick because of the white spot that the adult female has on her back. In terms of disease transmission, Lone Stars are primarily responsible for ehrlichiosis and very commonly seen on Long Island. The symptoms are very similar to Lyme disease, so if you suspect either Lyme or ehrlichiosis, you need to see a physician and have them do tests to determine which disease you're carrying. The black-legged or deer tick carries anaplasmosis, Lyme disease, babesiosis. Again, by far and away, Lyme is most common, though occasionally the other two diseases do show up. And there's some question in the medical literature whether or not black-legged ticks might also carry Bartonella, but that's just not well known at this point. In terms of number of cases of Lyme disease in New York State, what's confirmed by the Federal Center for Disease Control, Atlanta, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 new cases of Lyme disease are reported by physicians and confirmed. What we don't know is that, the rate of underreporting. These are actually laboratory confirmed cases, and there's some concern that this may just be the tip of the iceberg, with Lyme disease being so prevalent, their physicians may not be reporting all the cases that likely occur because they don't get laboratory tested. How can we manage Lyme disease in deer herds? Some people promote direct reduction in deer densities. I question whether that's really feasible. Most suburban areas, the literature fairly clearly shows that in order for tick population, black-legged tick populations to crash, you need to get deer densities as low as somewhere between 8 to 10 deer per square mile. Many of our urban areas have numbers exceeding 80 to 100 deer per square mile. So without a very concerted effort, I question whether you can get down below densities of less than 10 deer per square mile. For parks and areas that particularly where children play, playgrounds, those type of things, it might be most effective to fence deer out of those areas so the deer aren't dropping ticks in areas where children or other park visitors might pick those up. We've done experimentation with 4 poster devices. These are essentially large corn hoppers with what looks like paint rollers on each end. Certified pesticide applicator has to apply permethrin to the rollers on a weekly basis and replenish the corn when ticks are active. And then deer feed on corn in a feeding trough at the end of the device, rub their head and neck against the paint roller, and treat themselves with permethrin. We saw reductions in deer tick densities and Lone Star tick densities on Long Island between 80 to 95% in areas where we put out 4 poster devices, but right now they're only registered by New York State DEC for use on Long Island, nowhere else in the state. And there are some landscaping things that you can do to try to minimize ticks in and around yard areas. It's possible to, with black-legged ticks, to create a what we would call a tick-safe zone around properties. Black-legged ticks desiccate very easily in full sunlight, which means they dry out, and so they like to be in more shaded, moist areas and shrubby, wooded areas around the edge of yards. So if you can put a stone barrier or a wood chip barrier around the edge of your yard, at least 3 feet wide, that creates a dry, sunny area that the ticks have to cross in order to get to your yard. And then if you try not to put gardens or children's play equipment another 3 yards in past that, it's very unlikely that ticks are going to cross that barrier on their own and get into a yard area. That doesn't mean that deer still can't cross the yard and drop a tick, but it's less likely ticks will get there on their own. What can we do to manage deer in urban, suburban areas? If we don't want to do any population control, then we're really looking at damage control on individual properties with things like repellents or fencing. I want to emphasize that feeding deer is illegal in New York State, and people shouldn't be feeding deer anyhow because that just potentially may increase populations and habituate deer to people. If we want to look at population control techniques, there are 2 groups, lethal and non-lethal. Under the lethal control techniques, the 2 things that tend to be most viable are either some form of hunting, traditional or controlled hunting, or potentially baiting and shooting deer under a deer damage permit. Capture and killing deer with nets and traps tends to be less accepted in communities. Predator introduction is really a non-starter. There's already predators in urban areas, and if you could even get predator densities high enough, there'd be likely attacks to people and pets too, so that's really non-viable. And I put commercial hunting down with question marks. Right now it's not legal in New York or any other state, but some of the wildlife professionals are starting to start a discussion about that, and that might be something that would be available several years into the future. In terms of non-lethal techniques, habitat alteration rarely is viable. We're in urban areas and yards, and people just aren't going to change their yards greatly. Capture and relocation is also usually not viable. It's expensive to do. There's really no place to take the deer, and some of the deer don't survive transport due to capture myopathy. So really the only non-lethal techniques are either transient fertility control with immunocontraception or permanent fertility control with surgical sterilization. Both of these are considered experimental in New York State at this time and require a research permit. By far and away, the way most deer populations are reduced is through recreational hunting. And where it's feasible and practical in community areas, it should be encouraged. It's the lowest cost thing that you can do, try to control deer abundance and negative deer impacts. For communities that or areas that might be closed to hunting by local regulation. It is possible sometimes to get deer damage permits if you have safe shooting zones, but people that are interested in this should contact their regional Bureau of Wildlife office. And for individual landowners, it might be possible to get deer management assistance program permits to take additional deer on specific properties during the normal hunting season, and we use those on parts of our university property, such as our Arnott Teaching and Research Forest. And under some situations, it might be possible to get special urban deer permits for things like fertility control research, but these are very limited cases, and you need to have an actual research program in place. Fertility control is experimental. Although it's theoretically possible, it hasn't been all that well proven in the field, whether it's both biologically feasible and economically practical. There's a couple of ongoing studies right now, one in the village of Hugo Heights, New York, where 98% of the female deer were captured and surgically sterilized, and we're still currently collecting data to see if that works out to be a viable technique. Usually only females are treated with fertility control. The reason is the rose petal hypothesis. Most young female deer will set up their home ranges near or adjacent to their mother. Bucks are dispersers, and if you treat bucks in an area as fawns, they're just likely to disperse into a new area to set up their home range. Has a limited scale, usually areas much larger than 2 to 4 square miles in size. Any area larger, it becomes impractical because of the cost and number of deer you need to handle, and there's annual maintenance that's required to maintain high levels of infertility. There will always be some immigration into areas unless they're fenced, and so these new deer need to be treated to maintain 90% plus fertility control. In terms of management options in communities, again, we like to look at an IPM approach or integrated pest management approach. Some communities, population management may be the tool, whether it's hunting or lethal removal through bait and shoot might be viable. Some areas, the scale of the actual impacts may be small enough where fencing could be suitable, and then individual landowners can reduce impacts with repellents and plant selection. There are a lot of factors that influence deer feeding pressures in urban areas, just like they do in rural areas. Population density is one of the biggest. Urban rural fringe areas tend to have very high deer abundance in many areas throughout New York. Here in central New York, I measured densities of 100 to 125 deer per square mile fairly routinely in some of these urban rural fringe areas. Food and cover sources and travel corridors are important, particularly if you're using more deer resistance plants. The feeding pressure can vary yard to yard within a suburban community, and those yards that are close to cover sources and along travel corridors might suffer 2 or 3 times the feeding pressure that other properties might see nearby. Alternative foods and season and weather are important. When you get a really severe winter, deep persistent snow, deer will take ornamental shrubs and other plants they wouldn't routinely take in other years. Deer nutrition is important. What are the fat reserve? What are the quality of plants they've been feeding on? Plant palatability and nutrients are important. In urban areas, people often fertilize their landscape plants, fertilize their garden plants. Deer can detect this increased nitrogen. They seek it out in the landscape and may cause more severe damage to plant materials that are heavily fertilized. And previous experience is important. The adult female deer often will feed with fawns, and by watching their mothers, they learn which plants to eat and which plants not to eat. Some general rules of thumb for reducing plant damage. Repellents tend to work when the deer pressure and feeding damage is light, either it's short-lived or deer densities are relatively low, so that the damage is only occurring usually during a month or two time frame during the year. Fencing or a physical barrier of some type provides the only reliable control when deer damage is moderate to heavy. We try to encourage communities to manage herd density, reduce plant damage and impacts, and it's possible to choose plants that are less attractive to deer in terms of landscape ornamentals, and we'll discuss some of those. In terms of repellents, there are a number of products that have an EPA registration and actually a database that have been field tested. We know things that tend to be egg-based, like big game repellent or deer away, often are the more effective of the deer repellents. Excuse me. Deer off, another egg-based product, also tends to be more effective than some of the other things that are on the market. We also have learned that products that have bitter compounds, things like Tree Guard, which has denatonium benzoate, those products tend to be less effective for deer control because deer have all sorts of bitter compounds that they sample in natural plant materials. We've conducted a number of feeding trials in the Ithaca area. We usually conduct them on Japanese ewes, a preferred deer food during the winter months when deer are most hungry. Control shrub like this, you can see numerous deer tracks around the plant. About 40% of the plant surface area is gone for untreated plants. In winters with deep snow, they're often severely impacted by deer. Our repellent trials have shown that products like big game repellent and deer off, excuse me, tend to reduce deer damage the most. In the top line, you can see that no plants were damaged, 100% were undamaged for 4 weeks with the 4 products that contained egg-based compounds. After week 6 even, these products start to fail. By weeks 8 and 10, none of the commercial deer repellents are providing suitable plant protection. What we know and learn from this is that in order for repellents to work, they need to be reapplied every 4 to 5 weeks. That's great during summer months when temperatures are higher. It's usually impractical in New York State in winter because we have freezing temperature and snow, so the repellents just cannot be applied. Consequently, for year-round protection, deer exclusion alternatives are best. 8-foot barrier fences around home gardens are the most effective, but also the most expensive solution. For fencing like this, a homeowner might spend $6 to $8 a linear foot to get a fence installed. Individual plant protection is also possible. You can put plastic netting or metal netting on stakes around shrubs and ornamentals that you want to protect. And for home gardens, electric fencing can provide fairly effective protection for small garden plots. You need to check local ordinances. Some communities do not allow electric fencing in New York State. Baited electric fences, those that have aluminum foil tab with a mixture of peanut butter and oil, tend to be more effective than just a plain electric fence. The reason for that is that you train the deer to the fence, the odor attracts them to the foil tab. They touch it for the first time with their nose or their tongue, and they get the voltage on the electric fence through their nose or tongue, and creates a strong aversive conditioning, and they often don't challenge the fence again. Also, there are plants that are relatively rarely damaged by deer, even under high densities during severe winters, things like boxwood, Colorado blue spruce, American holly are extremely deer resistant. These are starvation foods. If deer are eating blue spruce in your yard, there must not be any other foods available to them. So it is possible through careful selection to design a more deer-resistant landscape that looks well. On the other end of the spectrum, there are a number of woody ornamentals that we know are severely damaged quite often during the winter months. For the Christmas trees, things like balsam and Fraser fir are often the Christmas trees that are most highly damaged by deer. Fruit trees, things like cherries, plums, apples are heavily damaged. Any plant that tends to be evergreen during the winter months, like rhododendron, azaleas, yews, we often see very heavy deer damage. So these type of plants that are on the frequently severely damaged list, if they're in your landscape, even in mild winters under low deer densities, you might see damage, and these plants may require protection. We've done trials looking at perennial bulbs, which ones tend to be deer resistant and which ones don't. And again, if you with very careful selection of spring bulbs, you can end up with very attractive spring flowers that are very unlikely to be damaged by deer. In our field research trial, we tested things like narcissus, daffodils, hyacinths, crocus, and a variety of other commonly used spring bulbs. And we compared those against tulips. We know by far and away of all the spring bulbs, tulips are the ones that are most favored by deer, and they take most readily. When we looked at the results from repeated trials, no big surprise. When we looked at mean damage score, by far and away, tulips topped the list of the bulbs most likely taken and flowers most likely taken by deer, but also crocuses rank fairly high. So if you can avoid planting tulip and crocus bulbs and rely on things like hyacinths and irises and allium, it is possible to design a very deer-resistant landscape. Most of the spring bulbs are not heavily damaged by deer. In a summary on urban deer management, if you've got plants that need protection, by far, Exclusion provides the best long-term deer control and reduction of damage, especially during the winter months. Repellents have their place, especially the egg-based products can provide limited short-term control. Things like, again, some of the spring perennials, if you've got tulips, it's possible to treat those repellents and keep those from being damaged by deer for several weeks. You can choose ornamental plants carefully, more deer-resistant plants to reduce damage and impact. But I want to emphasize there's really no plant that's completely deer-resistant. At extremely high densities in heavy snow conditions, I've seen deer eat barberry, which has no nutritive value whatsoever. Scare devices, some of these things you'll see marketed are usually completely ineffective and a waste of time and money. And in communities where there's open lands and hunting is viable, should try to encourage hunting and removal of female deer to try to lower deer populations and negative impacts. Hopefully you found some of the information I presented today to be helpful in controlling deer impacts on your property and in your community. Thank you.